Okay, so this is the second video in the series on swaps. You can see here that B seems to pay way over the odds relative to A for fixed rate quotes, but when it approaches banks, it only pays 0.5% relative over what A is charged on the floating side, and that then looks like some kind of market inefficiency. Interestingly, the swaps allows us to exploit the disparity in the rates, and interestingly, it also kind of maps out. If we look here a little bit at the how we might the terms we use here to describe the situation, we talk about comparative and absolute advantage. These terms are kind of relatively old terms in economics. I think we can go back to David Ricardo, who was a British political economist in the early 19th century, and he made use of these terms when describing kind of rationale for international trade. And Ricardo came from a merchant family, was a stockbroker, and actually made a lot of money from the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo. He bet on the right side and so on. So he was a markets person, but he also was somebody who took a real profound interest in economic topics. And in particular, he took an interest in the concept of what he called comparative advantage, which is still invoked today when we try to justify the basis of international trade. And his view was that countries should specialize in what they do best, and he made reference to Portugal and United Kingdom. Portugal would have an advantage in producing wine, and Britain would have an advantage in producing wheat, and it obviously would make sense to trade the surpluses. But Ricardo went a little bit further. He said even if you have a country that has an advantage in producing both, absolute advantage in producing both, there still would be some basis for specialization, and countries should specialize in what they do best and trade whatever surplus they have. Now that idea is kind of borrowed here, and we certainly borrow the vocabulary of absolute and comparative advantage. We can see that Company A has a comparative, but more importantly, absolute advantage at the 12%, and a absolute advantage at the floating rate. But B has a comparative advantage in the floating rate. And again, what we might say is B should borrow where it has the keenest edge, and should borrow at where they have comparatively some advantage. And A should borrow where they have a comparative advantage. So that concept is useful. Now, in structuring the swap, our starting point is both of the counterparties should gain 4% or 0.4% here. Why we would say that is because when we take the difference between the spreads, the differential is 0.9%. And if we allocate 0.1 to the structurer or to the financial intermediary, that would leave 0.8 when divided equally, would mean any borrowing costs could be reduced by 0.4%. Importantly, A wants floating. A wants this, but its advantage, comparative advantage is here. B wants a fixed rate, but B's comparative advantage is on the floating side. So we want to structure a swap where A gets its floating rate, B gets its fixed rate, but benefit to the tune of 0.4%. Okay, so go to the next slide and look a little bit at the analysis. So again, we would say A wants what? A wants a floating rate, but we will make initially, in structuring the swap, we will say A should borrow at 12%, because that's where it has its comparative advantage, absolute, but also importantly comparative advantage. And even though B wants a fixed rate, which would cost 13.4 typically, we're going to force B to borrow at where it has a comparative advantage. Okay? And then we would say if we were to give both counterparties a gain of 0.4%, then what B's net position should end up being should be 13.4 minus that 0.4%. So we should have borrowing costs. We should be able to structure the swap so that the overall borrowing costs to B would be 13%. And to A wants to borrow floating, we make A borrow fixed. But we have to engineer a swap so that A's position should be LIBOR plus that 0.1 with the benefit of 0.4. So we take 0.4 away from 0.1, we get negative 0.3, and overall LIBOR minus 0.3. Okay, so then how do we structure this swap that's going to go on a few years? Well, we first of all, again, this is not etched in stone, but purely by convention, we might say, okay, there is going to be a floating wing on this swap, and we just default to LIBOR. So we can take the LIBOR rates as given. We don't have to structure it with LIBOR here, but on the floating side, we might just go with LIBOR for the moment. And then we would say, okay, if B receives LIBOR, pays out LIBOR, what rate overall should B pay here to the financial intermediary so that its net position is 13%? And the rate that B should pay here should be 12.4. And if B receives LIBOR, pays out LIBOR 0.6, that's equivalent to paying out the LIBORs cancel, and the net position would be 0.6 purely on the floating side. If we put that 0.6 with 12.4, that nets to 13%. Okay, so then we look at A's position. We have to engineer this out because that's what A currently could get, but we've got to do 0.4% better. And we make A borrow at its comparative rate, the rate that it has the comparative advantage, which is the 12. Okay, so we're forcing 12 even though they want a floating rate. And the question then is, given that we have this LIBOR being paid to the financial intermediary who's structuring and who's the custodian of the swap and who's managing the credit risk and so on, okay, and paying 12, what rate should A be paid by the financial intermediary? So the overall position would be LIBOR minus 0.3, and that rate would be 12.3. So if A receives 12.3, pays out 12, they're up 0.3. And if they are paying LIBOR, so in a sense you're kind of receiving 0.3 over the 12 paid out here. That's a positive. This would be a negative because you're paying out. Combining the two together, overall what A is paying in terms of its rate of interest on borrowings then would be, netting the three amounts, it would be LIBOR minus 0.3. The only final thing then that remains to be validated here is, does the financial intermediary get its 0.1 that we outlined at the beginning here? And we can say yes, it should, because LIBOR cancels with LIBOR. Company B pays 12.4. The financial institution or intermediary pays 12.3. These cancel, up 0.1 here, so we can say yes, the financial institution, its net position is 0.1. So overall what we've done here, we have structured a swap where each of the counterparties, both counterparties benefit to the tune of 0.4. Compare, A does want a floating rate, it gets a floating rate. The floating rate is 0.4 better than the original quote from the bank. And B's position, originally B wants a fixed rate loan. The rate that they have available in the market is 13.4. If we were to engineer a 0.4% improvement on that borrowing cost, that would bring down their borrowing cost to 13. The swap allows us to engineer this 13% outcome while also allowing 0.1 to be made available to the financial intermediary. Again, the financial intermediary has to be paid something because they have to run a swaps book. They have to find A and B. They have to have a certain amount of collateral and so on to manage the credit risk. So this is not trivial. So the financial institution is getting something for negotiating this swap between the two counterparties. Last thing really to identify here is in this instance where we have a plain vanilla fixed for floating swap, where there's no difference in currencies, where the fixed rate and the floating rate are denominated in the same currency. It turns out that you can get the same outcomes by doing a variety of different things. So we could pay B here, instead of paying LIBOR, we could pay LIBOR 0.6, and that would exactly offset this figure here. And it would also make clear what B should pay the financial intermediary would be exactly 13%. And over here, because A is paying out 12, we pay A 12. The two 12s offset each other. And then to engineer this LIBOR minus 0.3, we just pay the financial intermediary LIBOR minus 0.3. When we take the four rates here, 13, receive 13, pay 12, that's a gain of 1%. Receive LIBOR minus 0.3, pay out LIBOR plus 0.6, that's a loss of 0.9%. So the 1% gained and the 0.9% lost nets to 0.1% to the financial institution. Again, any combination or set of permutations are actually really possible here, and there are many different solutions possible. But typically, for convenience, we might do what we did here. Whatever rate is paid out here, offset it exactly as being a payment to company B, or stick with the convention of going with a LIBOR default on the floating side. Either will work perfectly fine.